Take that uniform coat off, Audrey, or leave the house immediately. Your sister-in-law's reception is tailored for prominent city developers, and your burnt jacket is actively lowering the property valuation of this entire gathering." Those were the first words my father said to me when I stepped across the limestone threshold of the Reynolds family estate in Lake Forest, Illinois. Not, "How is the skin graft on your right arm healing after the hangar fire?" Not, "Did the Naval Medical Review Board in San Diego clear your respiratory charts?" Not even, "It is good to have you back alive after 20 years on the flight deck of the USS Nimitz." Just the property valuation. Before I could answer, a sudden draft from the open terrace hit the right sleeve of my utility coat, causing the deep, thick tissue scarring along my forearm to throb with a sharp, heavy heat. I didn't reach down to rub the arm. I didn't adjust my posture. I let the physical burn steady my mind, filtering out the distant clinking of wine glasses and the laughter of 30 city developers gathered on the manicured lawn. My father, Alistair Reynolds, didn't look at my arm. He didn't see the heavy canvas aviation sea bag hanging from my left shoulder. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on the doorframe, his jaw set in that cold, executive sneer he used whenever my unpolished, military presence threatened his local political ambitions. "Leo's assignment as an elite fighter pilot for the Strategic Air Command is the entire foundation of my municipal campaign," he added, his voice dropping into a vicious, low whisper as he checked his gold Rolex. "The City Council Procurement Committee is sitting out on that lawn right now. If they see you limping through the terrace in wrinkled government issue, they will assume this family comes from common labor. I will not let 20 years of your unrefined lifestyle drag Leo's prestige down before he even delivers his keynote brief." Then, when he realized my hand wasn't moving toward the zipper of my coat, he struck his heavy gold signet ring against the marble console table with a sharp, definitive click. The sound was flat and hollow in the high foyer. He turned on his polished loafers, his designer tuxedo jacket shifting precisely as he walked back toward the terrace to pour another round of high-end Napa Cabernet for his campaign donors. I stood completely still in the shadow of the entryway, watching him walk toward a massive, 7-foot oil painting hanging in the main dining room. The canvas depicted my younger brother, Leo, standing in front of a digital flight line, wearing a pristine flight suit with a pilot's helmet tucked under his arm. My father had paid an art student $12,000 to paint that portrait from a digital file Leo had sent from a private airfield in Virginia. Alistair Reynolds. Leo was the family's golden pilot, the military prodigy who had allegedly cleared the Pentagon's most exclusive stealth airframe qualifications. But my eyes weren't processed by the gold leaf frame or the dramatic lighting of the portrait. They were focused strictly on the survival vest buckles painted over Leo's chest. The quick-release harness pins were mounted upside down, a structural safety violation that no aviation life support specialist in the United States military would ever clear for a live taxi run, let alone an active flight line. Leo was performing. My father was worshipping. And as I carried my sea bag down the narrow oak stairs into the dark basement utility room, my scarred arm pulsing with that heavy uniform burn, I knew the ledger in this house was completely out of balance. But to understand how I got down into that basement, and how my own blood came to believe that my 20 years of active service was nothing more than an open credit line for Leo's fraudulent lifestyle, I need to go back to the first entry in the tracking system. My name is Audrey Reynolds. I am 45 years old, and until my medical retirement 45 days ago, I held the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 5 within the United States Navy, serving as the senior air boatswain, the air boss, on the flight deck of the USS Nimitz. My current civilian existence is entirely modest by deliberate choice. I live in a rented 2-bedroom stone cottage 3 miles outside the perimeter of Naval Station Great Lakes, Illinois, within walking distance of the cold, gray water. I drive a 9-year-old utility truck with a dented front bumper from a collision with a deck tractor during a night storm in San Diego. I do not wear jewelry. I do not use makeup. My entire professional identity is stored in secure federal data registries that 99% of the civilian population will never have the clearance parameters to read. 24 years in the Carrier Aviation Command structure changes how your eyes process documentation. When you spend your youth managing the structural physics of a 4-acre flight deck, handling 70-ton aircraft launching via steam catapults into 60-knot headwinds, while aviation fuel pumps throb and engine exhaust burns the air, you lose the capacity to be impressed by country club real estate or luxury cars. My physical body carries the permanent price of that education. The deep tissue burn running from my right wrist up to the shoulder blade was earned when a high-pressure hydraulic return line ruptured during a recovery cycle near the Taiwan Strait. On damp, low-pressure, Midwestern mornings, the bone throb serves as a continuous reminder of what true national service actually costs. When you manage 70-ton jets on a burning flight deck, numbers that don't match are not mistakes. They are anomalies that get people killed. Procurement networks use the same encryption math. I knew exactly where to look. But while my skin requires covering, my analytical mind remains perfectly clear. My military training taught me a fundamental law of aviation logistics. Check the master manifest before you clear the airframe. When a con artist believes they are the most sophisticated actor in the room, they stop checking their digital exhaust. They commit their financial infractions in the open, because they assume the people around them are too unsophisticated, too intimidated, or too desperate for proximity to prestige to ask for the system transaction numbers. They look at a woman with a stiff right arm, short hair, and a faded canvas sea bag, and they see an invisible government laborer. They do not realize that some of us spent our careers hunting logistics fraud for the Pacific Fleet Command, managing data systems that track millions of dollars of federal hardware to the single decimal point. When I sat down on the cot in the basement utility room that evening, I didn't send an angry text to my father. I didn't call Leo to demand an explanation for why his name was attached to my mother's estate files. I simply laid my government-issued, hardened Panasonic Toughbook laptop across an old wooden storage crate, connected my secure military network access device, and opened a clean, secure command terminal. I didn't react, I opened a spreadsheet. I knew my father believed my long deployment cycles had left me blind to his private commercial maneuvers. He thought that because I didn't participate in his frantic, status-chasing dinner table arguments about municipal contracts and local elections, I was just a compliance mechanism, a reliable, quiet daughter who would allow her service record to be used as a rubber stamp for Leo's commercial validation. He had miscalculated the nature of my silence. In my line of work, when a senior aviation auditor goes quiet, it doesn't mean they've stopped tracking the numbers. It means they've just opened the official evidentiary file. The Reynolds family presence in Lake Forest was built entirely on a carefully curated illusion of permanent prosperity. My father had made a comfortable living in commercial real estate, but comfort was never his goal. He craved the specific, untouchable prestige that came from political influence and proximity to federal authority. When my brother Leo failed out of his second year at an unranked aviation training school in Virginia in 2022, my father didn't view it as a failure of discipline, he viewed it as a public relations crisis. Leo, however, understood our father's psychology perfectly. Within 6 months of his academic dismissal, Leo returned to Lake Forest with a transformation that was as sudden as it was spectacular. He began wearing tailored flight blazers, using acronyms like SAC, DLA, and Andrews, and talking about high-level airframe procurement modernization initiatives that he was shattered to be managing from a private office near Washington. The first financial indicator appeared in September of 2025, while I was stationed at a military logistics hub in Yokosuka, Japan, tracking supply chain discrepancies. I noticed a suspicious transaction pending on my mother's maternal inheritance fund ledger. My father called me 48 hours later. "Audrey, it's a simple administrative request," my father had said, his voice dropping into that familiar, smooth pitch he used when negotiating a commercial lease. Leo's Academy, Aura Flight Systems, is applying for a preferred vendor status with the Federal Defense Infrastructure. The banking underwriters need to see that the family has a documented history of high-level military compliance. Your active clearance profile provides the necessary institutional weight. It costs you nothing to let Leo attach your service record to the corporate registration file. Aura Fly Systems is a private commercial entity, Dad. I replied over the encrypted satellite line. My security clearance belongs to the federal government. It cannot be used as a marketing asset for Leo's corporate applications. You have always been so incredibly narrow-minded, Audrey. My father snapped, his tone instantly hardening with class anxiety. Your brother is working with senior officials at the Pentagon. He is helping shape national security infrastructure, and you are worrying about administrative technicalities. Leo is building a legacy that will elevate this entire family. The least you can do after 20 years of living on the government taxpayer's dime is support your brother's commercial validation. I said nothing. I was counting. The second wave of escalation occurred 8 months later, in November of 2025, while I was undergoing treatment for my skin graft at a military base in Virginia. I received a notification from my military banking institution regarding an inquiry into my Veterans Credit Line Registry. Leo had listed my name as the Chief Compliance Director on a commercial escrow application filed through a regional bank in Chicago. The loan amount was exactly $350,000, secured against my mother's maternal inheritance fund. The application stated that the funds were required as liquid earnest money to secure an exclusive Pentagon contract for flight simulation logistics. I called Leo directly from my office in San Diego. He answered on the third ring, the background noise of an expensive Washington restaurant clear over the connection. Audrey, relax, Leo chuckled, his tone light, condescending, and entirely devoid of panic. It's a standard corporate bridge loan. Dad approved the escrow allocation himself. We listed you as compliance director because the bank's automation algorithms prioritize applications that feature senior active duty military officers with clean audit records. It's just theater, Audrey. Once the Strategic Air Command releases the initial mobilization advance, the loan is cleared and everyone wins. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Did you sign my name to the compliance affidavit, Leo? I asked, my voice flat, dead, and steady. I signed it as an authorized agent of the family corporation, Audrey, Leo replied, his confidence entirely undisturbed. Dad signed the primary corporate authorization. We are a family unit. We use the family's assets where they generate the highest projected return. You don't understand how federal procurement works at this level. It's about presentation. It's about showing the underwriters that you have the institutional pedigree to manage the volume. The subtext was clear. To Leo and my father, my 24 years of unblemished service wasn't a record of personal honor or sacrifice. It was an unexploited credit line. A clean, silent fund they could bleed dry to buy tailored blazers and luxury cars to maintain their status at the country club. They looked at my refusal to engage in domestic shouting matches, and they assumed I was predictable. They thought that because I was a quiet soldier, I would always step back to let Leo shine brighter. I let them spend. Every unauthorized transfer path they carved through my military network wasn't a victory. It was just another heavy anchor locking them tighter into the federal criminal jurisdiction. By June of 2026, the total financial exposure tied to Aura Flight Systems, backed entirely by my mother's inheritance and my forged military credentials, had reached exactly $350,000. Every single dollar documented on my secure external hard drive. And then, while I was on a medical evacuation flight over the Atlantic, they executed the third wave, the final withdrawal that cleared out the remaining principal of my mother's escrow, leaving the balance at absolute zero. Have you ever been treated like the dependable family member everyone counts on, right up until the moment you needed help yourself? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about family, loyalty, and hard-earned self-respect speak to you, subscribe to the channel. The clock on the wall of my kitchen read exactly 1:13 a.m. when I sat with my laptop while the highway hummed outside the perimeter of the Reynolds estate. The basement below me was freezing, the stone floor pulling the heat directly through the soles of my combat boots. The only light in the structure came from the harsh, clinical blue glare of my Toughbook screen, reflecting off the frost patterns on the narrow window glass. I had spent the last 3 hours connected to the Federal Flight Tracking Database, utilizing my senior logistics investigator credentials to run a frame-by-frame verification of the airframe registries listed on Leo's Strategic Air Command vendor certificate. The UMENT he had displayed so proudly to my father bore a contract code, SAC 2025 AF00814. It looked authentic to the untrained eye, complete with the standardized federal layout, the clause markers for national security exemptions, and a rendering of a digital signature belonging to an active airframe coordinator at Andrews Air Force Base. 24 years of fleet logistics data entries had trained my eyes to spot a counterfeit server hash in less than 40 seconds. The problem for Leo was that I had spent 6 years writing the verification algorithms for that exact database during my tenure with the Pacific Fleet Logistics Command. I zoomed in on the airframe transaction hash code, processing the cryptographic metadata with a 2-pass forensic filter. A real federal flight log contains an encrypted string that matches the pilot's Department of Defense ID number and the precise atomic clock timestamp of the airframe's engine cycle. Leo's hash code was a static, repeating string of random alphanumeric characters. It didn't match any active F-35 deployment in the Federal Registry. It was a digital drawing, a counterfeit. I leaned back in the old wooden desk chair, looking at the cold coffee sitting on the edge of the packing crate. I didn't drink it. My breathing was perfectly flat, my pulse dead steady at 62 beats per minute. Counting. Not anger. Not revenge. Counting. Leo hadn't just exaggerated his flight credentials on a resume. He had created an entirely fictitious military status to convince my father to clear out the primary maternal inheritance escrow account, a $350,000 asset that was currently listed as the primary collateral for a final, massive private capital fund Leo was raising from a group of local real estate developers. The investment closing was scheduled for the upcoming Friday evening at the Defense Partners Annual Summit, held at the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom in Chicago. My brother signed the UMENT with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that I might understand what it said. He believed his presentation was flawless because his blazers were tailored and his verbal delivery was smooth. He didn't understand that on a federal monitor, confidence doesn't have a data type. Only numbers exist. Only timestamps remain. I clicked the Save button, watched the file transfer verify, and closed the laptop lid with a soft, clean click. The space was perfectly quiet. The file was sealed. The following 4 days required absolute tactical precision. I maintained my position in the basement utility room, ignoring the loud, celebratory dinner parties taking place in the main house, as Leo's investment partners arrived from out of town. I didn't engage in their conversations. When my father came down to the basement on Wednesday morning to ask why I hadn't filed the probate clearance affidavit his attorney had prepared, I simply told him that the paperwork was being processed through the proper channels. I let them celebrate. I was building a file. On Thursday afternoon, I drove to the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago to meet with a trusted expert, a senior forensic investigator with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, named Marcus Vance. We sat in a small, windowless interview room that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale plastic. I laid a heavy, navy blue plastic binder on the metal table between us. It contained exactly 198 pages of printed federal flight logs, cryptographic system audits, and verified escrow tracking data. It weighed exactly 4.1 pounds. Marcus didn't speak for 20 minutes. He turned the pages frame by frame, his reading glasses catching the harsh fluorescent light of the ceiling grid. He stopped on page 64, tracing his finger along the forged airframe hash code Leo had utilized to pass the bank's initial automated compliance checks. When he finally closed the binder, the sound was short, heavy, and definitive against the metal table. "Audrey, this isn't a civil asset dispute between family members. This is an active, aggressive procurement fraud scheme targeting private commercial banking systems using counterfeit federal military credentials. He didn't just lie to your father. He utilized forged Department of Defense authorization codes to secure a $350,000 commercial escrow line on a federal wire network. That's a direct violation of Title 18, Section 1001, false statements to a federal agency, and Section 1343, wire fraud. I know, I said, my tone completely authoritative, lacking any trace of domestic emotion. The audit ledger on page 114 details the systemic continuity of the forgery. Every UMint uploaded to the bank came from the IP address assigned to Julian Sterling's office, the family's corporate attorney. Marcus leaned back, looking at the binder. Your brother is scheduled to sign the final private investment contracts tomorrow night at the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, correct? Alistair Reynolds is listed as the primary corporate guarantor? Yes, I replied, my voice steady, cold, and entirely composed. My father is providing the maternal inheritance titles as the final security allocation for the private capital pool. He believes he is becoming a primary development partner for the Strategic Air Command logistics infrastructure. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a secure mobile communication device. The regional U.S. attorney will issue the emergency seizure warrants within 2 hours of this file being formally entered into the judicial queue. I will coordinate with the local federal marshals. Do you want this processed quietly at the regional office? No, I said quietly. The fraud was built on public presentation, Marcus. It should be closed before the exact audience they used to validate the lie. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was an arena of pure corporate theater. The room was illuminated by soft amber lighting that reflected off the massive, floor-to-ceiling mirrors lining the walls. Over 400 executives, defense contractors, and local financial investors moved through the space, their conversations creating a low, continuous roar that sounded like rising water. At the front of the ballroom, a massive LED presentation screen displayed the logo for the Defense Partners Annual Summit, flanked by the corporate branding of Aura Flight Systems. I stood against the marble pillars near the service entrance at the back of the hall, in strict accordance with the text message my father had sent me that morning, demanding that I avoid wearing anything that might distract from the dignity of Leo's signing ceremony. I was wearing a simple, dark charcoal woolen coat, buttoned to the throat, with no military identifiers, no service ribbons, and no rank insignia. I had been instructed to hold my father's spare briefcase and stay clear of the primary networking circles. I remained quiet, holding the leather case, invisible. 40 feet ahead of me, Leo was the center of gravity for a large circle of private equity investors. He was wearing a custom-tailored flight blazer, his teeth flashing white under the lights as he pointed toward the digital displays behind him. My father stood directly beside him, his chest expanded, his face flushed with the intense satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally secured his place among the state's commercial elite. The Strategic Air Command contract parameters are fully locked, Leo announced to the crowd around him. His voice projects with effortless, theatrical confidence. Our allocation hashes have passed the secondary review at Andrews Air Force Base. This $350,000 escrow expansion is the final operational component required to clear the mobilization advance from Washington. We are offering our private partners a preferred entry tier before the federal funding cycle goes live next month. One elderly investor, Mr. Henderson, nodded approvingly, his gold pen hovering over a leather-bound signature booklet. The military compliance pedigree is verified, Leo. The underwriters confirmed your sister's oversight record? Leo smiled warmly, waving a dismissive hand. Our compliance profile is completely unassailable, Mr. Henderson. My sister, Audrey, has managed the baseline technical parameters. But let's be honest. Her carrier deck experience is largely manual labor. She doesn't operate at the strategic Pentagon level, where these airframe procurement structures are actualized. I stepped out from the shadow of the marble pillar. I didn't sprint. I walked down the carpeted center aisle of the ballroom, my left knee clicking softly with every second step against the floorboards. The heavy navy blue plastic binder was held securely in my right hand. My father saw me when I was 15 feet from the presentation table. His posture instantly stiffened, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward to block my path. Audrey, "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice dropping into a desperate, furious whisper. "I told you to remain in the hospitality suite. This is the final signing tier. Get back to the rear of the room immediately." I didn't answer him. I walked past him, as if he were a piece of the ballroom furniture, stepped directly to the center table, where the investment contracts were laid out, and dropped the 4.1-pound binder directly over the leather signature booklets. The heavy plastic cover made a sharp, definitive smack against the wood, the sound cutting through Leo's presentation audio. The crowd around the table went completely still. The gold pens stopped moving. Leo's smile didn't vanish, but it turned brittle, his eyes darting to the folder, then to my face. "Audrey, please. We are in the middle of a commercial closing. If you have an administrative question about your retirement paperwork, take it to the office on Monday." I didn't look at him. I pulled my secure terminal interface device from my pocket, connected it to the hall's local media hub, and executed the master system override command. The giant LED screens behind the stage went completely black for 4 seconds, the corporate logos vanishing instantly. The audience exchanged confused, quiet glances. Then the screen loaded a single, massive federal UMINT, the Certified Wire Transfer Intercept Ledger from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. The shortest sentence in the entire script landed in the absolute silence of the room. Page 14. Your signature, September 12th. The ballroom grew quiet. Every eye turned to the display. The image on the screen was a 5-foot-tall rendering of Leo's counterfeit contract award, completely defaced by a massive, bright red federal audit watermark that ran diagonally from corner to corner. Invalid contract hash. Airframe entry denied. Federal forgery compiling. Leo's face lost every ounce of its color in a single, physical second. His hand went to the edge of the mahogany table, his fingers slipping against the wood as his breathing became short and shallow. The theatrical performance had completely evaporated, leaving nothing but the terrified, hollow look of a con artist who had just watched his paper empire catch fire. Leo's attorney, a senior compliance counsel named Vance Caldwell, who spent 15 years in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, stepped forward to grab the binder, his hand trembling slightly against the heavy plastic cover. He turned to page 14, then flipped frantically to the certified master strike logs on page 92. The entire table of investors watched his eyes widen under the amber chandelier lights. He didn't look at Leo. He didn't look at Alistair Reynolds. He slowly turned his head to look directly at my face, his executive confidence completely shattered. "Mr. Reynolds, drop your pen," Caldwell said, his voice dropping into a dry, flat whisper that carried clearly across the frozen perimeter of the table. "You have no contract. This audit wasn't generated by a regional administrative clerk." Alistair Reynolds slammed his hand on the mahogany, his face flushed with localized fury. "Caldwell, what are you talking about? It's an internal family dispute. My daughter is just a carrier technician. She doesn't have the clearance parameters to override this system layout." Caldwell closed the binder with a heavy, hollow sound and stepped back 3 paces, completely removing himself from the family's space. "You don't even know who she is, do you, Alistair? This is Chief Warrant Officer 5 Audrey Reynolds. She wasn't just a technician on the Nimitz. She was the senior air boss for the entire Pacific Fleet Logistics Command. 3 years ago, when the defense procurement rings tried to forge the aviation manifest codes in San Diego, she was the primary federal investigator who ran the forensic deployment matrix that sent 4 corporate board members to federal prison. Her signature is the exact verification authority that clears active airframe transactions for the Pentagon. The ballroom grew completely, perfectly quiet. Not even a glass moved. Mr. Henderson slowly lowered his signature booklet into his leather case, his eyes fixed on Leo with a look of absolute, unvarnished contempt. The theatrical performance was completely dead, and the silence that followed was the loudest accounting this room had ever witnessed. The next page loaded automatically, a line-by-line financial wall detailing every single transfer from my mother's escrow fund directly into Leo's personal account. September 12, 2000 $50,000. November 18th, 2025. $200,000. April 14th, 2020 say. $100,000. Total confirmed diversion. $350,000. The private security office behind the grand ballroom was small, utilitarian, and smelled of cold industrial floor wax and stale plastic. It was a space designed for holding shoplifters and disruptive guests, a profound contrast to the amber-lit luxury of the Ritz-Carlton hall we had just left. My father sat on a low vinyl bench, his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed so low that the thinning hair on his crown looked exposed under the raw fluorescent tubes. Leo sat in a metal chair across from him, his custom flight blazer wrinkled, his eyes fixed blankly on the gray linoleum floor. Special Agent Marcus Vance stood near the exit door, two local federal marshals standing quietly behind him, with their hands resting on their utility belts. "You have destroyed this family, Audrey," my father said, his voice barely a whisper, completely stripped of that executive authority she had used to banish me to the basement 4 days ago. "You took your brother's future, and you displayed it like a circus exhibit in front of every financial partner I have spent 40 years building relationships with. If there was an administrative error in the filing, we could have resolved it quietly. We could have hired an auditor. You didn't have to humiliate us." "It wasn't an administrative error, Dad," I said, my voice dead calm, carrying the heavy, unchanging weight of a military investigator who had spent her life reading back numbers to people who thought they would never be counted. "It was federal procurement fraud. It was a calculated, criminal forgery designed to use my 24 years of military logistics service as a shield to secure a $350,000 bank loan for a lifestyle Leo didn't earn. You knew the credentials were fake when you signed the escrow waiver, Dad. You just didn't care, because the presentation looked important enough to buy you the status you wanted." Leo didn't look up. He rubbed his left thumb against his palm, a nervous, repeating tell that showed the performance was truly over. My father lifted his head, his eyes red and wet under the clinical white lights. "You have always been so bitter, Audrey. You never could stand to see your brother succeed. You have your pension, your government security. You have everything. Leo needed this contract to become something. You have ruined our name." "Our name didn't have integrity, Dad," I replied, my voice completely smooth, devoid of anger or triumph. "It just had a paint job." I reached for the heavy plastic buttons of the dark charcoal woolen coat my father had ordered me to wear to hide my identity. One button, then another, then another. I pulled the heavy wool away and laid the coat across the back of the security officer's desk. Beneath it sat my white dress uniform, pristine, pressed, and structurally perfect. A gold shoulder boards of a Chief Warrant Officer 5 reflected the harsh fluorescent tubes of the ceiling grid. The dense rows of ribbons crossed my left breast, a 24-year record of silent, lamented sacrifice in environments where my mother and sister wouldn't have survived 48 hours. And beneath the third row sat the commendation medal, with an valor device, its metal clean and heavy against the white fabric. The room went completely, perfectly still. My father froze, his eyes locked onto the medal, as if he were looking at an alien artifact. Leo's shoulders tightened, his breathing stopping for 3 full seconds. They weren't looking at the invisible clerk who carried briefcases anymore. They were looking at the officer, whose signature had cleared compliance pipelines across 3 continents. The officer whose honor they had tried to borrow to fund a flight academy scam. "I am not your compliance mask anymore, Father," I said, delivering the liberation signal with absolute finality. "Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. I stopped doing all the work to preserve your illusions, and it turns out that was enough to let the truth do its job." Before either of them could formulate a response, Special Agent Marcus Vance stepped forward, pulling 2 sets of standard steel federal handcuffs from his case. The marshals moved in behind him. "Leo Vance, Alistair Vance, you are under arrest for federal procurement fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code. Please step forward and place your hands behind your back." The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't involve a dramatic speech or an explosion of hot temper. It was just the clean, metallic clicking of steel rings closing over tailored cuffs, and the low rustle of silk coats being adjusted as they were led out the side corridor toward the federal transport vehicles waiting in the rain. 6 months later, I stood on the wooden pier overlooking the Severn River just after sunrise. The morning air was sharp and cold, smelling of diesel fuel, wet cedar, and the deep, clean salt of the low tide moving through Annapolis Harbor. The water moved below the piers, a massive gray mass completely unbothered by the dynamic of the shore. It did not need to scream or announce its density to the world, it simply carried its weight. A group of young naval cadets walked past the training center entrance, their boots hitting the wood in a loose, rhythmic cadence as they carried their logistics manuals toward the morning lecture hall. One of them waved to me as they passed. I nodded back, a simple, quiet acknowledgement between people who understand that a ledger is something you protect with your life, not something you wear as a costume. I reached into the inner pocket of my utility jacket and pulled out a simple, matte black government-issue plastic ballpoint pen, the standard 3-cent utility tool I had used to log system errors for 2 decades. I used it to sign a routine hardware clearance report on my clipboard, then slid it back into my pocket. The gesture was small, ordinary. It carried no gold plating, no country club registry, and no false authorization. It was just an honest mark on a real asset, a circle completed on my own terms. My terminal phone sat inside my jacket pocket, entirely silent. For the first time since I had returned to American soil, my stomach didn't tighten when the screen illuminated. There were no more urgent, demanding group messages from Lake Forest about corporate underwritings, no more frantic legal humans from my father's attorneys demanding my compliance signature, no more internal calculations running through my head during the hours after midnight. The weight was completely gone. Not the memory of the betrayal, but the pressure of the role I had allowed myself to carry for 30 years. The role of the quiet, dependable daughter who would absorb the damage to keep the family looking successful. The Lake Forest estate and the flagship Flight Academy assets had been liquidated 3 months ago under a federal asset forfeiture order to satisfy the restitution demands of the regional banking pool and the private equity investors Leo had deceived. Leo accepted a plea agreement in federal court last month, 48 months at a medium-security correctional facility in Indiana. My father, due to his age and his secondary role as a guarantor rather than the primary architect of the forgery, received 2 years of federal probation and a permanent corporate fine that stripped him of his real estate licenses. Prestige is a remarkably fragile thing. Everyone wants to stand near its warmth when the lights are bright, but nobody wants to be found within miles of the wreckage when the ledger finally calls for the true balance. My father lives now in a small, respectable townhouse outside Milwaukee, surviving entirely on his basic Social Security allocations, the exact kind of ordinary, unglamorous existence he had spent 40 years of his life committing ethical compromises to avoid. Our fly systems went offline permanently on a Tuesday afternoon. By Friday, his investment partners were already pretending they had never heard the family name. Maybe you are the reliable one in your own circle. Maybe you are the responsible one, the person everyone counts on to maintain the family's structural integrity while everyone else plays at success. There is no shame in being that person. The world functions because quiet, orderly people show up to do the work every single day. The destruction begins when your value in that circle becomes entirely dependent on your willingness to let them exploit your credibility for their comfort. Helping a relative through a period of genuine, unforeseen misfortune is an act of love. Funding somebody's endless, arrogant vanity because they refuse to operate within the parameters of reality is enabling. Those two things are not the same, and they never will be. The people who benefit the most from your lack of boundaries will always be the loudest, most vicious critics when you finally decide to build them. They will call you bitter. They will tell you that you are destroying the family name because you are jealous of their potential. They use those words because guilt is the only leverage they have left to force your signature. You are allowed to create boundaries, even with your family, especially with your family. You are not a compliance tool for people who do not respect your honor. You are not required to make your own career, your own name, or your own retirement smaller, just so that your relatives can pretend to be bigger than they are. Never sign a UMINT you cannot survive losing, and never let anyone tell you that blood requires you to co-sign a felony. I spent 24 years in the service, protecting the network borders of my country's infrastructure. But somewhere along that journey, I forgot to build a secure perimeter around my own soul. I believed that stepping back and remaining silent was the price of keeping domestic peace. I was wrong. Silence in the face of fraud isn't strategy. It is complicity. And human dignity is something you can never afford to negotiate. Because once you stay silent just to preserve harmony, you are simply feeding the arrogance of people who have started treating your sacrifice as their permanent entitlement. I turned away from the river, slipped my hands into my pockets, and began my walk toward the training center, where a new class of cadets was waiting for their morning instruction. My step was clean, my posture straight, the white dress jacket carrying the weight of my own actions and nothing else. I wasn't carrying my mother's shawls anymore. I wasn't carrying her illusions. I was just Audrey Reynolds, walking forward into a quiet, ordinary morning, carrying nothing at all. If this story meant something to you today, and if you needed a reminder that your honor cannot be borrowed by people who haven't earned it, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need this exact reminder in their life right now.